Welcome to today's webinar presented by MEOPAR and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. MEOPAR is a national network that funds marine and coastal research across Canada. Today's topic is Fathom, Industry Insights into Flood Hazard Modeling Methods. My name is Shiree Kotar, and I'm the coordinator for the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum, a community practice based at the University of Waterloo. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Andrew Smith, Chief Operating Officer of Fathom. Andrew co-founded Fathom after completing his PhD at the University of Bristol in the UK in 2014. Andrew's research focuses on the development of flood hazard and risk models under future climate scenarios at regional and national scales. Today, Andrew will present on Fathom's US flood model, which has gained media attention over the past year since their release of floodfactor.com, a website where Americans can look up their address and find out their present and future flood risk. Thank you, Andrew, for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
These days, my job title is Chief Operations Officer at Fathom. The reality is that I'm a flood risk scientist, so I did a PhD building flood models under different climate scenarios, and my research really began to focus on building flood models at large scales and trying to build flood models in really data poor areas as well. So like Jason said, part of this talk is to chat through our work in the US, and I can't take credit for Flood Factor. So Flood Factor is a website. It's a great website launched by a partner of ours who are a nonprofit organization in New York called First Street Foundation. And First Street Foundation are the guys who've made some of these data available for the US public to go and view. And it's the first time that these kinds of data have been made that widely available. So part of this talk is to chat through our work in the US, but I'll also chat through building these kinds of model structures anywhere in the world. And I've got a bunch of use cases to chat through as well. So as a really quick intro to Fathom, so Fathom was formed by essentially a bunch of flood risk scientists at the University of Bristol. So the University of Bristol in the UK is one of the leading research groups in the world building these things called grid-based two-dimensional flood models. It's why I moved there to do my PhD about 10 years ago now. And it was whilst undertaking that research that we had, I guess, the insight and the idea to start a company. And that was principally because of the insurance market, who were telling us that the kinds of things that we were exploring as researchers was interesting to them commercially. So without further ado, I'll crack on because I've got quite a few slides to get through, but we've got time for questions at the end. So any questions, let me know. So firstly, I always like to start this kind of talk outlining why you should care about flooding. And usually it's not really needed, this slide, because people see big flood events all the time in the news. They appear to be getting worse is the general consensus of the public. You kind of see lots and lots of these seemingly big disasters happening more and more frequently, whether that's driven by climate change or driven by changes in exposure, so places being urbanized on floodplains. The kind of general message is that things seem to be getting worse, and you can actually pick out any number of really large figures to illustrate this point. Floods cost a lot of money every year. It's the most costly natural disaster in the world. And unfortunately, they also cost a lot of lives as well. So what is it that we can do about flood risk as a peril? Well, one of the things that we can do now is to build these, I think, like really incredible computer models. We can build very complex, very accurate, in fact, flood models that can simulate the physics of floods happening. And we can do it with, like I said, really incredible accuracy. So the model on your screen at the moment, this is an animation of a dynamic flood event in Des Moines in the US. And it's designed to give you an idea or a representation of what can be done when we have lots and lots of data and lots of time to build small scale models. So these kinds of models at these kinds of scales, when you have lots of input data sets, are not only really precise in that we can simulate the peril at really high resolutions, but they're actually very, very accurate when we measure them against things like observed events. For example, we can build models like this that are within error of real world events. And what I mean by that is that when we're observing a real world event, either from aerial photography or going out and kind of measuring high water marks, there's some uncertainty even in those observations. Well, these models in many cases are within error of those observations. And that's really fantastic. And that's actually kind of where we were 10 or 15 years ago. We were building models at small scales with lots of input data sets and lots of manual time that were within error of observations. And that's great because they're very, very accurate models and they end up in a whole bunch of different industries now. But before we pat ourselves on the back, when we move away from those small scales and we move away from areas in which we have lots of great input data sets, building flood models becomes really difficult. And in fact, so difficult that even kind of 5 years ago, for the majority of the planet, we didn't have good flood hazard information for most places. So the color scheme here on this map of the world indicates our view of national scale flood hazard information. So it was only for a few small territories around the world where we had what we deem to be good flood hazard information. Even in places like the US, there was only partial coverage of flood hazard information. And for the majority of the planet, there was no kind of large scale, comprehensive information available. And the reason for that is simply down to the fact that flooding is a very spatially complex peril. You can be wet in one spot and dry in another. And to really simulate the peril well, you need a whole load of quality input data set. You need really high resolutions, and the data itself, again, has to be of high quality. Without those data sets, building models becomes really, really difficult, and in fact, impossible even a few years ago. And the US is a great demonstration of this, because even in the US, where they have, I guess in my world, seemingly limitless resource to spend on building these models, they still don't have anywhere near comprehensive coverage. They've been going around building patchwork models across the country. And where those models exist, again, they're fantastic models. Really, really accurate. We absolutely advocate that those models are still built. But unfortunately, building models in that way doesn't give you comprehensive coverage. Even in the US, 40% of the country is unmapped. And the majority of the existing data are out of date, even by their own measure of what is in date. So the real question for us as researchers, back when I was doing my PhD, was, well, how do we move from small scale models, so models of like individual cities or individual rivers, to models that cover like a whole country or a whole continent? Like how do we solve that problem? And there was actually a list of problems that we had to solve. And those problems were at global scales, principally terrain data sets. So we don't have, and it's still a huge problem, really accurate terrain data sets at global scales. We don't have measurements of extreme flows on all the rivers, even in somewhere as well gauged as the US. We don't have gauges on all the rivers. We don't know the size of all the river channels. Actually, for the whole planet, even knowing where the rivers are exactly has been a real problem until recently. And then we have the problems around the complexity of these models. They're typically built with kind of engineering teams who would go out and survey the river channels and spend a lot of time manually building models of individual model domains. That process is simply not, it's providing comprehensive coverage is not feasible in that way. There has to be an element of automation in these models. They have to almost kind of build themselves at continental scales. And the last real problem is efficiency. We're solving somewhat complex physics here at really high resolutions. We've been trying really hard over the last decade to speed these models up as much as we can. And the advent of better computers is also helping us with that. But we formed the company essentially to address this problem. And Fathom itself is, we call ourselves a research-led organization. And that is true. So Fathom is publishing papers all the time. We've published 9 papers in the world's best journals in the last 12 months alone. We're a research-led organization. And I'm quite proud to say that we're publishing more papers now than most research groups in our field. And we really have now begun to achieve a scaling up of these models. We're building models not just of the US, we're building models of the whole planet. So Fathom has built models covering pretty much every single river on the planet. But do the models work? Well, one of the things that we set out to do when we built our first model of America back in 2017 was to validate the model and check how it looked against these small scale models where they exist. And we published this work a couple of years ago. And I think the amazing thing about this piece of research, which we undertook in collaboration with Google, is that it showed that these large scale modeling frameworks are beginning to converge on the skill of these small scale models. So we compared our US model against the Federal Emergency Management Agency's data where they exist in the US. And what we found was that the model can largely replicate those data. And when you think that, I think the most recent estimates we've heard are that the FEMA catalog has cost over $10 billion US to make. When you think about like this model framework that we built, that I can assure you has cost a lot less money than that, a small fraction of that amount. When you think about the fact that these model frameworks are beginning to replicate that skill, I think that's pretty amazing and also, of course, really encouraging. What are the implications of these model frameworks? Well, if we look in the US, I mentioned already that FEMA will say that they don't cover 40% of the US, but they do cover 60%. Well, even in regions where FEMA will state they have coverage, actually what you find when you look at our data against FEMA's data is that in these areas, they seemingly miss a lot of the headwater regions, lots of the small river channels. So this is something that we published a few years ago. We kind of wanted to put some numbers to this. So we teamed up with the EPA and published a paper whereby we compared exposure estimates using our hazard data and FEMA's hazard data combined with population data from the EPA. And what we found is that there's a threefold increase in the number of people exposed to flooding when you change the different hazard data sets. So the population data set is staying static here. We're just changing the hazard data. And again, there's a threefold increase in the number of people exposed to a 100-year flood. Now, if you think back to the slide I showed a couple of slides ago, where I stated that where the two hazard data exist together, they give largely the same answer. What this suggests is that this big gap in exposure is just down to those small scale models not being comprehensive and not capturing all the risk. And I think just kind of as a side note, one of the interesting things that we've seen in recent years is that for some of the really big flood events in the US, like Hurricane Harvey in Houston, that roughly kind of threefold increase we've seen replicated. So 3/4 of the people inundated during Hurricane Harvey were not in government flood zones. So we kind of know this is anecdotally true. Whenever a really big flood event happens in the US, lots of people that get inundated aren't in these government flood zones. And as a small side note, one of the other interesting things that we found in this particular paper was that the number of people exposed to flooding is going to nearly double by the end of the century without considering climate change. So if we just use the EPA's own projections of where they expect people to be living in the US towards the end of the century, then we see this really large amplification in exposure. Again, keeping hazard static. But one of the great things about these model frameworks is that we can deploy them really quickly. And by redeploying them quickly, we can update them every year, or we can update them for things like different climate scenarios. Now, this leads me on to a big partnership that we took part in last year. And this involved a whole bunch of different organizations in the US, led by a nonprofit organization in New York called First Street. We deployed our model framework and we plugged in things like climate models. We plugged in hurricane models from MIT. We plugged in coastal boundary conditions from other partners in the US, and essentially try to simulate what we think future flood risk is going to look like in the US. This is, of course, a very difficult thing to do. It's fraught with lots of uncertainties. There's questions around how well climate models capture the physics of flood-driven rainfall, for example. But I think on the whole, the fact that we can even undertake these kinds of simulations where we dynamically simulate future flooding is a big step forward. And I think there'll be lots of advances in how we do this over the next few years. But for this project, we simulated out to 2050, and we sampled from the whole range of the climate model ensemble. So we came up with kind of low, medium, high scenarios for each time horizon. We used RCP 4.5 for this, so I guess what's deemed to be the modest emission scenario. And we also updated things like sea level boundary conditions as well. And this is kind of, this figure is from our partners First Street, and it shows the increase or decrease in some areas in the number of properties exposed to flooding in the US. And I guess unsurprisingly, what we see is that the Eastern Seaboard and Gulf regions are the areas that seemingly will bear the brunt of increases in hazard magnitude, principally down to increases in hurricane intensity. So those Gulf regions in particular, we see some pretty severe amplifications in things like storm surge. And I've got a picture that kind of illustrates this point. So this is Houston in Texas. And on the left, you can see the current 100-year hazard data for storm surge. And on the right, the reds are the future boundary conditions for the median scenario. And this is one of those areas where we see a really significant amplification in the number of properties exposed. So our US model, we've run pluvial simulations, so flash flooding. We've run fluvial simulations. So the fluvial simulations are essentially where we plug in the input boundary conditions into the river channels themselves. So we're simulating every single river in America. And for the modelers out there, it can be a bit of a gray area as to what is a pluvial event, what is a fluvial event. In our model framework, the definition is simply how we plug in the boundary conditions. So with the pluvial simulations, we're just raining into the model domain. With the fluvial simulations, we're plugging the boundary condition into the channels themselves for every single river with an accumulating area greater than 50 square kilometers. And we've also run the coastal simulations, which is something that we've done with a bunch of partners in the US. So a little more detail on the hazard data themselves. We typically provide these data to clients at 10-meter resolution for all of the US. It's every single river channel. So regardless of size, we can simulate all the channels, even if they're smaller than the grid size. We have something quite novel called a subgrid channel network that allows us to represent all river channels regardless of size. Our model in the US is again, the modelers might be interested in this, is not driven by rainfall runoff models. Instead, the input boundary conditions for the fluvial model are derived from the gauge network directly. So we link the gauge network and we link extreme flow behavior to catchment characteristics for all of the US. And we simulate all of this at multiple return periods. So from a 1 in 5 through to a 1 in 1,000 year event. And I'll talk about defenses in a moment, because defenses, particularly in the US, representing them is really important. And we think some of the most comprehensive defense data sets available. The pluvial model is similar to the fluvial in the big difference, again, is how we actually drive the model. So we're raining into the model domain. We have a whole bunch of assumptions in there for things like drainage capacity in urban areas. The channel network is functional in this simulation. So it's just operating subgrid. So we rain into the model domain, and the channels themselves drain and convey water across the model domain. Aside from that, it's similar story for the fluvial model in that we simulate 10 different return periods across the US. The pluvial simulations, interestingly, are often the things that, like, our insurance clients tell us are really useful, because these are the kinds of losses that they often experience and aren't captured by existing data sets. So things like the FEMA maps can capture lots of the big floodplains, but some of our insurance clients tell us that it's this off floodplain, what they call off floodplain, is the stuff that they find difficult to quantify, and that these data sets really help them with. So on to the defenses. So defenses in the US, again, you have to represent them or your model just isn't realistic. In the US, there are really significant defense structures across the country. They've been building like huge defense structures in some places over really long periods of time, but there's no central, complete and comprehensive defense data set. So you have to go around and pull together what you can and even come up with quite novel ways to represent defenses. And we've done that with an automated defense algorithm. So again, a piece of work we published a couple of years ago that can detect flood defense structures from high resolution terrain data sets, pick out things that we think are defenses and then preserve them in our terrain models. And Fathom, we actually ended up funding a whole PhD to focus on this stuff. When we were beginning to build models of the US, we realized that we really needed to get a better handle on defense structures, and hence why we ended up funding a whole lot of research into this. And I guess the really cool thing about our new US model and some of our partnerships in the US is that we've made these data available, or I should say, First Street Foundation have made these data available for you to go and look at. So the outputs of these large scale model domains are now viewable for every property in America. So you can go and type in an address and look at these data and kind of see what they look like. And it's kind of, I guess, in many ways, it's the ultimate validation exercise in that you can go and look at the data, and in some areas, undoubtedly, the data are incorrect. It's usually down to things like terrain data sets. So we don't have really good quality terrain data sets across all of the US. And in some areas that results in the model not being as good as it is in other areas. But on the whole, I think the feedback that that First Street have had since this was launched is that the model's capturing things that people know, or is capturing hazard that people know and have seen that exists in reality and isn't in things like the FEMA catalog. And yeah, this got a whole load of press last year when these data were released, not just because of the hazard, but also some of the exposure implications as well. But are the data actually any good? I guess is the thing that, as a modeler, I'm really interested in is making sure that these data have some accuracy, without being too cliche. The old kind of the old thing of all models are wrong, some are useful, is absolutely true. This model is for sure wrong, but we think we have good reason to believe that it's a really useful data set now. And I will demonstrate that hopefully by chatting through some of the validation metrics that we've undertaken and recently published. And so some of the things I'll chat about through the next few slides are a hit rate. So a hit rate is essentially where our model is wet, and according to a comparison with some benchmark data, it should be wet, with 0 being no correct hits and 1 being full replication. False alarm ratio is the opposite. So it's where the model is wet and it shouldn't be according to the benchmark data. And a critical success index is essentially a combination of those two things. So where you penalize for overprediction and you award for the model being wet where it should be. The thing that when I was doing my PhD, the critical success index, if you were getting kind of like 0.6, 0.7 on a critical success index, we were deeming that to be a pretty accurate model, given the uncertainties that will undoubtedly exist even in the validation data themselves. So the first bit of validation that we did in the US was to use data from the Iowa Flood Center. So the Iowa Flood Center is a group in the US who had a whole load of funding to go out and build really great engineering type flood models in the US. They spent, I think they had a really great resource to do this, go out and build some models that we could have faith in using as benchmark data. And what we found actually was that even the older version of our model, the original US model, had some really encouraging metrics against these data. So a 91% hit rate and a 9% false alarm ratio, improving with the new version of our US model to a 93% hit rate and a 7% false alarm ratio. So in essence, what that means is that the data looked very, very similar when you compare them against each other. In a comparison against FEMA data, again, the models looked really similar. So we actually, we compared, these metrics relate to high quality new FEMA data sets, not the entire catalog. When we compare against the entire catalog, the hit rates or the CSIs are not quite as good, but we kind of expect that because we know that lots of the data that exists in the FEMA catalog are really old and outdated. So a comparison against data that's been created in the last 5 years look like this. So in coastal regions, there's a 92% hit rate and a 12% false alarm ratio. Interestingly, in the coastal data, we're not surprised that there's an amplified false alarm ratio for the coastal data. And that's because in our model, we actually update things like sea levels to 2020 level. So we're expecting the input boundary conditions at the coasts to be a little more extreme than what they are in the FEMA catalog. And that's kind of what you see. And the bottom table shows a comparison of Fathom's US model a few years ago. So the one that was validated in the Google paper and this current validation. And what you can see is a nice improvement in the model. Principally, the improvement has come in the reduction of false alarm ratios. Now, we think that the way, again, I'm going to very quickly chat through some boring modeling stuff that some of the modelers might be interested in. The improvement here has principally come down to improvements in how we represent river channels. So previously, we were representing river channels or the size of river channels in a way that didn't account for backwatering effects. But we're now publishing a new dynamic channel solver that dynamically simulates how big the channels need to be to convey a certain volume of water. So the channels, in short, are as big as they should be according to our assumptions. And that's resulting in the model improving in terms of the false alarm ratio. So those two pieces of validation there are comparing 100-year events. So we're looking at a comparison of our 100-year data against FEMA's 100-year data. That's really useful, but actually an even trickier thing to try and validate against are more frequent floods. So those kind of like 1 in 5 year events, things that don't fill up the whole river channel. But getting a hold of those validation data is really difficult because principally they don't exist. So one of my colleagues, Oliver Wing, did something quite novel actually for our recent paper. And he validated the model using the entire national flood insurance product in the US. So the whole of the NFIP insurance policies were used here to validate the model. And what he did was he computed what the ratio or the loss ratio is at a 1 in 5 year level. So what's the proportion of buildings that should be getting wet at a 1 in 5 year level? And what you can see in the table there is that there's been a really nice improvement in our model. So the proportion of buildings getting wet in our model is almost exactly the same as what we see in the National Flood Insurance Program. It's saying nothing about the correct buildings being wet, just the ratio. But it is a really encouraging sign that the right amount of buildings are now getting wet, even at really kind of frequent flood events. So I thought I'd just quickly show what some of these data actually look like. Again, you can go on, if you go via our partner First Street, go on to floodfactor.com, you can go and look at the data themselves. But this is kind of what they look like. This is Dallas in Texas, and the red things are levee structures, and these are our fluvial data. And as we go up through the different magnitude flood events, what we see is that you can see some of the flood defense structures being overwhelmed at higher return periods. These are the data for our pluvial events, our flash flooding. And you can see as we ramp up through the different magnitude events, you can see all of those small channels coming into play. All of the stuff that insurance companies typically call off floodplain losses. Stuff that's actually really difficult to simulate. But seemingly these data, according to our clients, are skillful in representing losses that they do see in the real world. Okay, so I've spoken pretty exclusively so far about hazard modeling in the US, but I'm quickly going to chat about something called CAT modeling, which is short for catastrophe modeling, and that is something that is principally interesting for insurance companies. Now, insurance companies Hazard data is useful. It's great for them for things like underwriting. They can go and look at individual locations and identify whether that specific location is exposed at all. But actually, the tool that they require for exposure management are these things called CAT models. Now, CAT models allow you to analyze a whole portfolio of locations, and instead of getting just an idea of whether those locations are exposed, you actually get a numerical loss out of the end of the model. So an estimate of what the year-to-year losses could be on a specific portfolio of assets. Getting to that estimate of loss is actually a very, very complex and difficult process. And it involves the stages that you can see on this slide. So we move from static hazard data through to plausible event sets. So we have to come up with not just a view of what a 100-year event is for a whole country, but instead come up with plausible events. So what's the kind of what's the relationship between different catchments across a whole country or a whole continent? And that's another piece of work that we published a couple of years ago in the US. The paper's on our website if you want to go and see it, but it's a really nice piece of research that outlines how we can define the spatial dependency of flooding across all of America. Even if we, and this is the depressing part for me, and that is that even if we come up with really great hazard models and we come up with really what we think are really great ways to estimate event footprints, let's just say we have the perfect hazard model and we can perfectly simulate real world hazard. Even if we could do that, there would still be a huge chunk of uncertainty in coming up with estimates of losses. And that is because the vulnerability components of these flood models are very, very uncertain. And that's what we demonstrated recently in a paper that was led again by my colleague, Oliver Wing. He analyzed all of the losses from the National Flood Insurance Program. And what he found is that in many cases for different types of buildings, the probability distribution of losses for a given depth of water is almost flat. So a given depth of water can give you seemingly any loss. So we've done a whole load of research as well, trying to come up with plausible ways to estimate vulnerability. And then finally, you can plug those things into a financial engine to come up with the kinds of losses that insurance companies require. Just very quickly, again, this publication was the first time a large-scale dependency model was demonstrated in the US. And the red dots on your right are essentially plausible event footprints that the model spits out across the US. Our model itself covers 10,000 years of plausible simulations and over 500,000 unique flood events in the US. And very quickly on the vulnerability modeling, again, this is really depressing because essentially it shows that this specific component of a CAT model alone is very uncertain. And if you want to deal with vulnerability in a flood CAT model, you have to deal with it probabilistically. And that does introduce a whole load of uncertainty. So our US CAT model is available right now. If there are any insurers tuning in, you can go and access our CAT model via our partners NASDAQ. So NASDAQ have recently launched a risk modeling platform. It's really great for us because launching these flood catastrophe models is frankly really hard because they're huge. If you imagine having to host plausible event footprints at high resolutions for 500,000 plausible events, the model essentially becomes huge. And thankfully, we have partners like NASDAQ who make these data easily accessible. You can just you can go on the platform, plug in a portfolio, and get estimates of losses for different portfolios. Okay, so I will jump on to some examples of our data in Canada and then quickly chat through some global data and some use cases quickly because I know I'm running out of time. Given that I'm assuming there's we have a lot of Canadians in the audience, I thought I'd show you some of our data in Canada as well. So this is some of our hazard data in Ottawa, and I'll go through some of the different magnitude events. So this is a 1 in 10 year event going up to a 1 in 1,000 year event for the city. One of the things that we've recently done for a big bank in Canada is to carry out some exposure analyses for different portfolios, and even try and look at kind of what would happen to that portfolio should the frequency of the events change. So here we have an exposure analysis. So the red dots are exposed buildings and the blues are the outputs of our flood model. And again, as I ramp up through the different magnitude events, you see that the number of buildings exposed unexpectedly, or expectedly, sorry, goes up. And I think one of the cool things that we can do here is that we can come up with estimates of damages, but we can, even if you don't have these kind of complex and very uncertain modeling chains simulating future climates, you can, even with just using current hazard data, you can play around with the frequency of the hazard data themselves and come up with kind of uncertainty bounds for what would happen if those frequencies should change. And this is something that we did recently for the Bank of England. So we kind of just perturbed the frequency of current hazard data and used that in kind of a sensitivity framework to come up with these views of plausible futures, or seemingly plausible futures. Okay, so I'm going to quickly chat through some of the global modeling, and just to say that in the beginning of our company's formation, we weren't actually planning on building or spending so much time building models of the US. We wanted to try and build models of the most data poor areas of the world, and that's still at the core of what we do. Unfortunately, building flood models in data poor areas is still really hard to do. And I thought I'd just highlight some of the points that have been most difficult to solve at global scales. The first one is terrain data sets. So if you're building a flood model, kind of very simply, water flows downhill. So if you don't know where downhill is, then your flood model is going to be pretty rubbish. And unfortunately, at global scales, we still don't have what I would call really high accuracy terrain data sets available. And in fact, some of the data sets we've had until recently have been really bad. And this is what you can see on your screen at the moment. So this is the Mekong Delta, and those stripy features you can see, they are not real. So those are instrumentation errors. They're actually caused by the pitch and roll of the space shuttle in space as it went around the Earth. So it just very slightly pitched and rolled as it went around. So we had those errors to contend with, but also all of the globally available products currently are radar products, and radar bounces off the top of trees and it bounces off the top of buildings. So you don't actually have a terrain model, you have a surface model, and that's pretty useless when you're building a flood model. You need a map of the Earth's surface. So as researchers, we've spent a whole load of time in the last 20 years becoming experts in processing terrain data sets. And luckily for us, we team up with, I would say, one of the best research groups in the world doing this, and they are based at the University of Tokyo. And if you keep an eye on your screen, I'm going to show you the corrected version of this data in the Mekong Delta. Now, this is what the latest version of our global data set looks like. It's something called Merit DEM, led by researchers at the University of Tokyo. And the cool thing is that our global terrain data sets are going to improve again this year. So there's been a new release of even better quality terrain data sets. And I think one of the things that we'll look back on in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, I think we'll look back at the kinds of data sets that we're currently able to produce at global scales and really be amazed at how far we've come just because of the improvements in terrain data sets. One of the things that we were kind of amazed at when we started the company was the fact that lots of flood models available commercially didn't even represent flood channels or river channels, sorry. Kind of goes without saying that when you're building a flood model, especially like a fluvial model, the representation of river channels is key to the model being behavioral. Like channels are the things that convey floodwater. They're the things that bring the floodwaters, and they're the things that drain the floodwaters away. So you have to represent those channels in your models. Unfortunately, even until a couple of years ago, we didn't have an accurate way to represent where the channels were or how big they were. Again, led by the University of Tokyo, something called Merit Hydro is a big improvement on our ability to represent where river channels are. And with our new dynamic channel solver, we're able to really implement our assumptions around what we think the bankful frequency of the world's rivers should be. And it really does matter. So I've got a little anecdote here for you. So this is, on the left is something called Hydrology, which was the previous map that large-scale modelers used to represent where rivers are. And this is just outside of Bangkok. So just outside Bangkok, the Chao Phraya River, which is the big river channel running into Bangkok, Hydroshed's got it kind of hopelessly wrong. It got it in the wrong place. And unfortunately, this is where it does matter, because the red circle on the left-hand side of your screen is an industrial estate called the Bangpa In Industrial Estate. And that's an industrial estate that got flooded really badly in 2011 in a huge flood event. And it actually resulted in the world's hard drive price being inflated by a third. That's kind of, if you think about it, that's pretty extraordinary. And that's all because a very large electronics manufacturer had half of their global shipments sat in that industrial estate, and it got flooded. So if you want to represent the exposure on that site correctly, you have to get the channels in the right place. And Merit DEM, as you can hopefully see, gets that big river, the pink channel, in the right place. So I will quickly flick through some pictures of what our global data look like in some really hard places. So this is in the Amazon, this is in Africa, Korea, and then this is some of the data that are used by insurance underwriters in Mexico. So simple, kind of like almost like traffic light categorizations of hazard. I will wrap up quickly with some use cases. So how these data are being used by different organizations around the world. One of the organizations who use our global data are the World Bank. So the World Bank license all of our global hazard data, and they use it for multiple things, but one of those things is a platform called Think Hazard, and it's a platform that gives an indication of exposure, hazard exposure for every single region of the world. So you can go and look at any province anywhere in the world and get an indication of what the expected kind of exposure is there, or the estimated exposure. Microsoft use all of our stuff, and they use it globally to look at potential exposure at things like data centers. They've actually been, I think, quite novel in that they've even used plausible event sets to look at correlations between data centers. So not just like looking at locations in isolation, but actually looking at how sites relate to each other. If a big flood event should happen, you want to make sure that the place in which you divert all of your data to isn't going to get wet as well. Insurers, I think, is probably quite an intuitive use case for everyone. So insurers use our data for underwriting purposes and for exposure management. And two of our longest clients are on the screen, so Canopius and Sompo, large global insurance companies who use our data both in the US and globally. I will just a couple more. So we work with a big global engineering company called Wrapup, and they use our data for quick screening of things like critical infrastructure. And we did this in Peru recently, and we looked at potential exposure of schools. 427 are a large or are a financial exposure organization, and they look at potential exposure of things like investment portfolios and how those things may be exposed to natural perils, flood being one of them. And we work closely with those guys, and they use all of our global hazard data. And my last two, so I think this use case is kind of novel and interesting. So we've actually worked with the Nature Conservancy in the US, and they've used these large-scale model structures to explore the removal of flood defenses. Now that might sound kind of insane, but actually in the US, the Army Corps of Engineers have built huge defense structures in some places that cut off quite large kind of agricultural pieces of land from the floodplain. Now that's kind of, that can be detrimental in that it cuts off natural floodplain areas, so it stops natural wetlands being natural wetlands, and actually can also amplify exposure downstream. So the Nature Conservancy used our models to explore the removal of defense structures, which was again quite cool. And my last slide actually is just to say that these model structures can be deployed really quickly. So we can rerun things like different scenarios. We can update them when new input data sets are available, but we can also try and undertake forecasts and these things that we call nowcasts. So we can run the model in real time. And we did this recently, just a few weeks ago. We worked with the UK Foreign Office, and we produced event footprints for the cyclone in Mozambique. And the data were used by the Red Cross on the ground. So I've rattled through a lot there, I know. I kind of chatted through pretty much everything that Fathom's doing as an organization. So I will stop talking there and hopefully leave enough time for questions. You can go and look at some of our data now. Go on Flood Factor. Again, thanks to our partners, First Street, for launching the initiative. It's been a really great effort on their part. And you can get in touch with Fathom, and we even have things like the Fathom Insights series. So if you've found my talk interesting, then there's more stuff to go and look at if you'd like. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in. Really appreciate the time.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your insightful presentation. I know that generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions about some of the modeling techniques. So just a friendly reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A box and I'll direct them to Andrew. So maybe the first question that a lot of people might be having would be, I guess I want to thank you once again for your presentation, but also there's a lot of strong interest in doing something similar in Canada. So what advice would you give to stakeholders about essentially how to begin and how they can, how this benefits improved modeling and mapping for other Canadian organizations? And does this lead to better decision making? I know it's kind of like a loaded question, but yeah.
Yeah, we of course, we have data at the moment in Canada, so Fathom's run models for the whole planet. And we have ambitions to build our own data sets in Canada. We won't be the only ones doing that. I think the general message should be that these kinds of large scale modeling frameworks are particularly useful in somewhere like Canada, because frankly, it's enormous. It's a very big country. So building kind of traditional model, building manual models of the whole country is just not feasible. But I just want to highlight that we don't advocate that like engineering companies no longer go out and build bespoke models of individual places. They absolutely should do that. The way in which the model structures that I've discussed here should be used is kind of to fill in the gaps. Like these data can be used to very quickly give you a view of hazard and exposure over a country like the size of Canada. And I think the really great thing about our work in the US is that we've demonstrated and proven that the models really do have skill, and we can, where we have good input data sets, we can build models now quickly and frankly, really efficiently, really cheaply we can build them. So it should be encouraging for stakeholders that these kinds of data are coming online.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on to the next question. So for coastal, I think this might be more technical, but for coastal areas specifically, how would you describe the bathymic quality data set, for example, in terms of spatial resolution or vertical uncertainty, if there's any other factors that have been accounted for?
I'm going to hold my hands up here and say that the coastal modeling is the one bit of this whole model framework that I've had the least to do with. So I will butcher our team's good work on that. I know that we simulate the hydraulics for the coastal modeling at 30-meter resolution for all of the US. In terms of the quality of the bathymetry, I'm not entirely sure, but if you'd like, I can put you in touch with Neil Quinn, who's heads up all of our coastal model development, and he can answer those questions. But yeah, the bit that I know least about.
No worries. So if anyone's interested in that, I'll leave his contact information in the chat later on. A lot of other people had questions regarding the computational infrastructure that's used to support all the modeling work. So if you can speak to that. Yeah,
it's people always find this really interesting, but we actually run everything on site. So all the compute is done on our own servers. So we have a very large computer in the basement of our office. And the reason that, well, firstly, people are often surprised that we do that because you think, well, just run things on the cloud. But the reason we haven't done that is kind of twofold. So firstly, we have a very high load of compute kind of constantly. The cloud is really useful when you have large spikes in requirements. But when you just have a really high base load, it just becomes really phenomenally expensive to run things on the cloud. The second thing is that, again, these are really high resolution data sets over large scale. So the input data alone are like very large. So the bandwidth required, or the cost required to upload and download those data sets alone becomes very, very expensive. So it's just easier to be able to essentially be hardwired into the computers. So yeah, we have a very large computer that sits on site.
Perfect, thank you. I guess maybe you did talk about this, but can you generally outline who are some of the clients? I know you mentioned insurers are huge, but if there's any other stakeholders that you could talk about.
Yeah, so I think like one of the things that's been great is that, and I'm not sure why we're surprised by this, because ultimately the clients who could use these data are like anybody interested in climate risk. But truthfully, when we set the company up, we thought this was just going to be stuff that was consumed by insurance companies, because the insurance market is the market in the sector that's most used to consuming these kinds of data. They've been using cat models for the longest time. Actually, that was the industry in which the whole cat modeling, that's where it emerged. So we thought insurance where we would sell most of our stuff. But we're actually now working with a whole range of different organizations. So I mentioned the World Bank. We work with the World Bank on multiple projects. We work with engineering companies. They can either use our off-the-shelf data or they can deploy our models really quickly. We work with insurance companies, of course, still. We work with insurers in the US, the UK, Japan. We work with large corporates, so you can use our data for things like exposure management at large scales. We're even now working with governments, and kind of large organizations like we may be building forecasting models for people like the UN quite soon. And I wonder who I'm missing. I'm probably missing other people as well. But yeah, the use cases for the data has been increasing all the time as well, which is really encouraging.
Great. And maybe just to add on to that, I think we have some people talking on behalf of maybe their private municipality, but how can they take advantage of this data in their work to identify pluvial, fluvial, coastal flood risks to inform decision-making at the local government level?
So I mean, we've worked with at the local government level, principally kind of in the UK and the US. I think the state of Virginia has used our data. I think I'm allowed to say that we'll be working quite soon with in Texas, so with the water board in Texas. Essentially, they can make use of our data by getting access to comprehensive data that, again, have proven skill, and can give you a really useful kind of screening tool. We don't advocate that these kinds of automated model frameworks are used to make important decisions on kind of design infrastructure, but they can be used to identify areas in which you should go and undertake more specific modeling, or where you should kind of focus your attention. So that's kind of how we frame these data sets, as a useful off-the-shelf way to conduct any number of different exposure analyses.
Perfect. And maybe I'm just looking at the time here. We'll do two last questions. So the first one would be, what do you think are the most critical gaps in flood hazard modeling that you think would need to be filled within the near future?
So I think if we're talking at global scales, then it is still terrain data sets. So getting a hold of better terrain data sets is the thing that really precludes us from building the kinds of models I've described in the US at global scales, or even in Canada, like having a terrain data set for all of Canada. That's kind of, so I don't think I mentioned this, the gold standard terrain data set is something called LiDAR data. So it's laser altimetry data. We don't have that we have it in lots of places in Canada. We don't have it everywhere, and we certainly don't have it everywhere globally. But the big thing that I think will change in the next few years is terrain data sets. They're coming online now. We have ways to build comprehensive, accurate terrain data sets globally. And frankly, we've been advocating that those kinds of data be funded for years. In the grand scheme of things, they're not that expensive to build. We're talking kind of, for the whole planet, hundreds of millions of dollars, which I know is not a small sum of money. But when you think about what you're getting for that sum of money, it's pretty good value for money. But I think that's the big gap that will be filled, is getting a better terrain data sets will fundamentally change what we can do.
Perfect. And I think we're going to wrap up right there. But once again, I do want to thank you, Andrew, for your amazing presentation. I think it opened up a lot of questions for people and has definitely given the drive for people to go back and further do some more modeling work. So we'll wrap things up once again by saying thank you to our attendees as well for sticking through our presentation. If you're interested in learning more about the CCRF, please visit our website at uwaterloo.ca/CCRF. We'll also be sending out a link to the recording within the next week or so, and so look out for that. Once again, I'd like to thank Meopar and our presenter, Andrew Smith, for Fathom. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar presented by Meopar and the Canadian Coastal Resilience Forum. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.